I've always found it strange how certain childhood memories remain engraved in our minds in an almost physical way. The smell of old wood in the hallway of my grandmother's building, the specific creak of the elevator as it passed the 3rd floor, even the distant echo of footsteps on the stairs. Last week, after more than 20 years, I decided to go back there. I don't know exactly what came into my head. Maybe pure curiosity. The building had been abandoned for years, but when I got there, I wondered. The facade, despite being dirty and worn, was still intact. The iron gate, which was always locked before, was begging. I entered without thinking much, as if the place was still familiar. It was E. But something in the atmosphere felt off. The silence was not the same. It was a tense silence, almost as if the building was holding its breath. I climbed the stairs slowly, feeling each step creaking under my weight. On the 3rd floor, where my grandmother lived, I stopped in front of Dr. 302. The faded green paint was still there, with the same crooked handle that I pulled when I was little. Before entering, I heard a noise in the hallway. I turned around and saw a man standing ahead. It was Mr. Osvaldo, the neighbor from 304. I remember him. Always quiet, always with that slightly suspicious look. He looked at me for a few seconds and then simply said, "He didn't swerve back." I was left without a suit, but before I could respond, he entered his old apartment and closed the door. My heart skipped a beat. The building was decommissioned more than a decade ago. What the hell was Mr. Osvaldo still doing there? I stood in the hallway for a while trying to process this. I remember hearing my grandmother comment years ago that the building had been evacuated after some people disappeared without explanation, including Mr. Osvaldo was one of the last residents to leave. But there he was, standing in 304, as if nothing had changed. I decided not to knock on his door. Something told me I wouldn't stray. Instead, he opened the door to 302, and it gave way with a loud click, as if the wood had been waiting for that movement for years. Inside, everything was covered in dust, but the furniture was still in place. The armchair where my grandmother used to knit. The wall clock stopped at 3:17. The musty smell was strong, and the air seemed thicker than I remembered. I spent the rest of the afternoon going through some drawers, pulling out some old photos and trying not to pay too much attention to the constant feeling that someone was watching me. When it got dark, I decided to sleep right there, on the couch. I thought it would be nostalgic. But around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a noise in the hallway. There were slow, shuffling steps, going back and forth towards the apartment door. I remained still, trying to hear better. Suddenly, a low voice, almost a suggestion, called my name. "Lucas, help me." My heart skipped a beat. It was my grandmother's voice. My body became paralyzed. It doesn't make sense. My grandmother died years before the building was evacuated. But that voice was identical. I recorded that timbre in my memory since I was a child. I lay there trying to find some rational explanation. Maybe it was the wind passing through the hallway, or some remnant of a dream. But then the footsteps stopped right in front of the door, and again the voice whispered, "Lucas, open the door. Please." The desperation in the voice hit me hard. It was the same intonation I heard once when she fell into the kitchen and called me to help. My instinct told me to stay where I was, but something stronger made me get up. I walked to the door on wobbly legs. I look through the peephole, but all I see is the dimly lit and empty hallway. I took a deep breath and unlocked the lock. When it opened, the hallway was deserted, but the air there was even colder, almost sharp. I took a step outside, and that's when I noticed. The door to 304 was ajar. A wisp of light flickered through the crack. It didn't look like electric light. It was faint, yellowish, almost like a candle. I approached slowly, my heart beating so hard I could hear it in the silence. When I got close enough, the voice came again. Now I heard it clearly coming from there. "Lucas, come in, quickly." My mind screamed at me to run, but my feet moved. I pushed the door slowly, and it opened with a sharp creak. Apartment 304 was completely empty. No furniture, nothing. Just the worn parquet floor, and in the middle of the room, a flickering candle. The light cast shadows on the walls, shadows that just moved in a strange way, as if something was there, only invisible. I looked at the candle, and behind it I saw marks on the floor, like barefoot footprints, heading toward a door at the end of the hallway. The musty smell was mixed with something metallic, something that reminded me of the taste of blood in my mouth when I slept as a child. I went into the hallway following the footprints. When I got to the door, I realized it was the old pantry. It was ajar. The candlelight didn't reach inside, but from the dark came a low, rhythmic sound, something between breathing and muffled crying. "Lucas," whispered the voice again, now very close, almost in my ear. My heart almost stopped. I knew this couldn't be real. My grandmother was dead. But that voice was always a cry for help for me. Gathering all the courage I didn't have, I opened the door at once. The pantry was empty. Just darkness and a cold that seemed to come out of there like a draft. But on the floor, the footprints continued, now turning into scratch marks, as if someone had been dragged inside. I took a step forward, feeling the ground grow cold beneath my feet. Suddenly, something ran past me, too fast for me to see clearly. I instinctively turned my body and saw Mr. Osvaldo standing in the corner of the room, motionless, looking directly at me. His face was different. His skin seemed tight, his eyes sunken and dull. "I warned you," he murmured. "You must not have come back." Before I could react, he took a step back and away, as if he had been swallowed by the shadow behind him. My survival instinct finally kicked in louder. I ran to the apartment door, but when I got there, it was locked. I tried turning the handle, kicking, punching, but nothing. It was then that I heard my grandmother's voice again, now coming from the pantry. "Lucas, help me. It hurts so much." The crying came next, broken, desperate. I knew it couldn't be her, but part of me couldn't ignore that request. When I turned to look, I saw the shadow of a figure crouched in the back of the pantry. The candlelight cast a familiar silhouette on the floor, but something was wrong. The arms were too long, and the head seemed to be tilted at an impossible angle. Even so, the voice continued. "Please, don't leave me here." I don't know how to explain what I felt at that moment. It was a mixture of absolute pleasure and irrational guilt. Her voice sounded so real, so familiar, that for a second I forgot everything around me. I took a step toward the pantry, then another. With each step, the crouching shadow seemed to adjust, as if it had been waiting for me. When I stopped at the entrance, the metallic smell became stronger, almost suffocating me. I reached out into the darkness, my breath catching in my chest. That's when something cold and bony grabbed my wrist tightly. The pressure was so strong that my skin felt burning. "Stay with me, Lucas." The voice now no longer begged. It was firm, almost authoritarian. I instinctively pulled my arm, but the thing wouldn't let go. The hand was thin and dry, with fingers that wrapped around my wrist completely. I screamed, kicked the ground, tried to free myself, but the force was absurd. Suddenly, I felt another touch, a hand on my shoulder. I turned my face and saw Mr. Osvaldo, pale and with a terrified expression. "Down!" he summarizes. Before I understand, hold me back tightly. I fell to the floor and saw, for a second, the shadow in the pantry stretch violently, trying to reach us. Osvaldo dragged my body to the door, which was now open. We ran down the corridor without looking back, and only stopped on the ground floor, where the rusty gate was already open, as if someone had been forced inside. When we finally stopped on the sidewalk, I turned to look at the building. The window of 304 was there, intact. But behind the glass, I saw a figure standing motionless. It was just a shadow, without a face. But its head was tilted slightly, the way my grandmother used to do when she called me. My cold heart. Mr. Osvaldo saw and held my arm. "Don't look. Don't come back," he said, his voice shaking. "They use what we love to draw us there. It's always been like that." I wanted to ask Osvaldo left me there and went back to the building, entering through the gate without saying anything else. When I tried to call him, he didn't respond. The next day, I looked for information about the building on the internet. I discovered that, years ago, several residents disappeared without a trace, including Mr. Osvaldo himself. The record indicated that he was one of those missing in the evacuation. Since that day, I never went back there. But every now and then, in the middle of the night, I hear a familiar sound in the hallway of my apartment, dragging steps, coming and going. And sometimes a voice whispering my name, with the same familiar tone as someone who just wants me to open the door. I worked the early morning shift in a little 24-hour store on the corner of a somewhat forgotten avenue, right next to an old cemetery. I always joke that what appears most here are drunks, insomnia, and sometimes a delivery guy trying to kill time. But there is one thing that has left me uneasy in the last few months. Whenever it rains at night, a man in a black suit appears. He goes straight to the fridge, takes a bottle of water, pays without saying a word, and leaves. It wouldn't be a big deal if it weren't for the fact that he never wets the ground, even when it's raining, and his face. Well, I can't explain it, but it always seems a little blurry in my memory, as if I can never remember the details. This week I mentioned it to Lucas, my shift colleague. He looked at me strangely and asked, "Are you talking about that guy who disappears out of nowhere?" That took me by surprise because I had never talked about it with anyone. I asked what he meant by disappears out of nowhere, and he explained that the times he had seen this man, the guy would walk out the door and then simply not appear on the external cameras. We decided that night to keep an eye on the live footage in case the silent customer showed up again. The forecast said it was going to rain, and it rained. The rain started around 2 in the morning. The sound of the drops hitting the store's awning was almost hypnotic, but the tension in the air didn't let us relax. Lucas stayed on the monitor, and I went to organize the shelves near the water cooler. That's when the door sensor made that characteristic beep. I immediately looked towards the entrance. Nobody entered. The glass was fogged with humidity, but I couldn't see any silhouette outside. Lucas called me from the monitoring room. "Man, the sensor activated, but no one appeared on camera." I walked to the refrigerator, and that's when I felt it. The floor there was dry. Even with the rain falling heavily outside, there was no trace of water, no footprints, and the bottle of water on the middle shelf was gone. I ran back to the monitor. Lucas had paused the recording the moment the sensor was activated. You could see the water shelf clearly. At 2:17 a.m., the bottle simply disappears, as if someone invisible picked it up. No figure, no shadow. Just the sensor activating, the bottle disappearing, and seconds later, the click of the cashier registering the purchase in the system. We looked at each other without knowing what to say. Then, in the top corner of the screen, a notification appeared. Motion detected. Corridor 4. Aisle 4 is right next to the stockroom, at the back of the store. And no one had been there that night. Corridor 4 is the only one that does not have a direct view of the cameras. It's right next to the door that leads to the stockroom, a corner that almost no one uses in the early hours of the morning. I took the flashlight and went there, with Lucas right behind. The floor of the store was damp from wind-blown rain, but when you turned down the aisle, the floor was completely dry. At the end of the hallway, the storage door, which we always keep locked, was ajar. I looked at Lucas, and he showed me his cell phone with the live camera app. No sign of movement. The only thing you could see was a slight flicker in the lighting, as if an invisible shadow was there. I took a deep breath and pushed the door. The stock was cold, much more than it should have been. The shelves were intact, but there were clear barefoot footprints on the floor leading up to the back wall. I followed the footprints with my eyes and saw something that made me freeze. On the concrete, right in the center of the wall, there was a dark stain of moisture forming the silhouette of a man in a suit. The curious thing is that it looked recent, as if someone had just touched there. It was then that the store's landline phone rang, a high-pitched sound that echoed throughout the room. The device was on the counter at the front of the store. We ran back, our hearts racing. Lucas answered and put it on speakerphone. On the other side, a deep, distant, wet voice. "Water, please." Lucas dropped the phone as if he had been shocked. The device continued to emit that low hiss, as if someone was still on the other end of the line. I ran to the camera monitor. Nothing at the entrance, nothing in hallway 4. But then the outside camera flashed and showed, for a second, a silhouette standing on the sidewalk, the man in the black suit. He was motionless, looking directly at the camera, even though he had no way of knowing where it was positioned. The rain was falling heavily, but the figure remained perfectly dry. The face was a pale blur, devoid of detail. When the camera returned to normal, he was gone. At the same time, the door sensor made a beep. We look at the entrance. The door didn't move, but the noise came from there. I went to the counter, and on the floor, right next to the water shelf, there was a new bottle missing. The system registered the purchase at the exact moment the sensor beeped. The strangest thing was the receipt that came out of the machine automatically. I took the piece of paper and felt a chill when I read what was printed. Customer 000. Product, water. Message, I'm waiting. My heart almost stopped. The store system does not print messages like this. I showed the paper to Lucas, and he turned white. "Man, let's get out of here," he said. But before we could run to the exit, all the lights flashed at once, and the motion sensor in aisle 4 beeped again. Corridor 4 seemed to breathe on its own. The lights flickered erratically, creating shadows that danced across the shelves. I picked up the stick we kept under the counter. I never thought I'd need to use it, and walked slowly toward the hallway. Lucas came right behind, holding his cell phone with the camera on. The ground was dry as before, but the air felt saturated with moisture, as if we were inside an open tomb. When I reached the entrance to the hallway, the metallic smell of stagnant water grew stronger. I pointed the flashlight toward the end of the hallway. The storage door was closed now, but on the floor in front of it was a single bottle of water, and next to it, a footprint-shaped puddle. Lucas swallowed hard and pointed his cell phone at the door. In the reflection of the fogged glass, we saw a figure behind us, tall, in a black suit, motionless. I turned my body reflexively, but there was nothing there. The hallway sensor beeped again. Lucas's cell phone fell to the floor, and the screen froze in a strange image. A pale face, without eyes, with a half-open mouth, as if whispering something. It was at that moment that the lights went out for good. We stayed in the dark, with the sound of rain outside, and the labored breathing of whatever was there with us. Suddenly, the silence was broken by 3 slow knocks on the warehouse door. And soon after, the muffled voice, "Water, please." I don't know where I got the courage, but I bent down, picked up Luca's cell phone, and used the flashlight to illuminate the door. The beats continued in rhythm, as if someone knew exactly the right tempo to keep the tension in the air. The door latch began to turn on its own, slowly. "Run!" I yelled at Lucas. We rushed towards the exit, but the automatic door wouldn't open. The system crashed. The glass began to fog up from the inside, as if someone was blowing on it from the other side. And amidst the fog, a word appeared written with an invisible finger. "Thirst." Behind us, the storage door finally opened with a sharp click. The sound of bare feet echoed across the tiled floor. We don't look back. We stood there, trying to force the glass door, until, without warning, it slid open on its own. We practically fell outside, in the rain. We ran without looking back, only stopping 2 blocks later. Lucas's cell phone was still in my hand. I opened the camera app and went straight to recording the moment of the knock on the door. The video showed the hallway empty. There was no door opening, no footprints, no figure. Just in the background, a low and continuous voice. "Water. Please." The next day, we went back to the store in the morning with the manager. We reviewed the system. In the images, no one entered. The bottles disappeared by themselves. The system registered each sale with the same customer, code 000. The manager thought it was a software error. I resigned right then and there. Since then, I avoid going near cemeteries. But sometimes, on rainy nights, my house phone rings. When I answer, there is no one on the other end. Just the sound of a drip. This happened about 3 years ago, when I was 24 years old, and working as a night attendant at a convenience store here in my city. I've always been one of those calm guys who lead a good life, without any big stories to tell. But what happened back then? Man, it still gives me chills. I lived alone in a small apartment on a somewhat deserted street, and my routine was always the same. I left work at 11 p.m., got on my motorbike, and followed an almost automatic route home. It was a simple route with few streets, always silent. But one day, I started to notice something strange. A black car, without license plates, seemed to appear out of nowhere whenever I turned onto the main avenue. He never got too close, but kept just the right distance for me to notice his presence. The first night, I thought it was paranoia. On Monday, I started to pay more attention. But it was on the 3rd night that it hit me hard. I already had that strange feeling of being followed, you know? That invisible pressure on your back. I looked in the rearview mirror, and there it was. The black car, with dipped headlights, always keeping the same pace as mine. It was then that I realized a detail that chilled my spine. The vehicle never passed through any closed traffic lights. It was as if the lights simply didn't exist for him. And most bizarrely, he always appeared at exactly the same point on the avenue, regardless of the time I left. On the fourth night, I decided to test it. I left work early, around 10:15 p.m., and took a different route, taking streets I never used. I passed through dark alleys along a busy avenue, and even walked around the block of my building before parking. Everything seemed peaceful. No sign of the black car. But when I turned off the bike and got off, I felt that familiar shiver. I looked ahead, and there he was, standing on the corner about 30 meters away. The engine was running, but the headlights were off. I couldn't see anyone inside. My heart raced. I ran into the building and locked the door so hard that the key got stuck in the lock. I went up to my apartment, shaking. I tried to calm down, thinking it was just some crazy person. But as I was convincing myself of this, my cell phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. The text was short, direct, and left me breathless. No need to run away. I already know where you live. I felt a chill run down my spine. The first thing I did was call the number, but it said it didn't exist. Then I went to the window, moving the curtain just enough to peek out. The black car was no longer there. But across the street, in the dim light of a flickering streetlight, there was someone standing motionless. He wore a black cap and a dark jacket. And even from a distance, I knew that that person was looking directly at my window. I froze there for a few seconds, holding the curtain with trembling fingers. The stranger didn't move, didn't look away. Nothing. It just stood there, like a human statue, under that flickering light that made the scene even more surreal. My heart was beating so hard, I could almost hear the echo in my chest. When I finally managed to move, I picked up my cell phone and called the police. I explained the situation, the car without license plates, the strange message, and the man standing in front of my building. The attendant said he would send a car, but his voice had that automatic tone of someone who thinks you're just freaking out. As I spoke, I looked through the crack again. The man was still there, but now his head was tilted slightly to the side, as if challenging me. I hung up the call and waited. The minutes seemed to drag by. After about 15 minutes, I heard the distant siren and ran back to the window. The police car arrived. The police got out and illuminated the sidewalk with flashlights. The man was no longer there. There was no sign of him. I went downstairs to talk to the police, still nervous, and one of them asked if I was sure I had really seen someone. I talked about the message, the car. One of the officers looked at the other and then at me. Well, there are no tire tracks here. No recent signs of a stopped car. Let's take a walk around the block, but it looks like it was just a coincidence. When they left, I stood at the entrance, trying to understand what was happening. That's when my cell phone vibrated again. Another message. You called the police. Now it's more interesting. I didn't know what to do. My mind went into a state of absolute alert. Do you know when everything around you gets a little stuffy and time seems to slow down? It was like that. I ran up to the apartment, locking every lock and running from one window to another, trying to see any sign of that car or that person. Nothing. The silence outside was almost suffocating. I turned on the computer and decided to try to trace the number that had sent the messages. I used one of those reverse lookup sites, and when the results appeared, my stomach dropped. The number belonged to a cell phone that had been deactivated for over 5 years. The registered name? Ricardo Mora. I didn't know anyone with that name. But the most bizarre thing was the note in the footer. Device associated with an emergency call recorded in 2018. My head was spinning. I went to the local news website and searched for the name. I found an old article. Man disappears after being followed by car, without license plates. The photo showed a young man in a black cap and dark jacket, exactly like the man I had seen on the street. According to the report, Ricardo had reported to the police, days before disappearing, that a black car was constantly following him. The vehicle was never identified. I walked away from the computer feeling a wave of dread wash over me. It was as if the floor had disappeared. I looked at my cell phone again. Another message appeared on the screen, without sound, as if trying to sneak in. "You're next." My body reacted before my mind understood what was happening. I threw my cell phone on the bed, put on my sneakers, and grabbed the motorcycle key. I needed to get out of there. Anywhere would be safer than that apartment. I opened the door and ran down the hallway, feeling my breath come short, almost painful. When I arrived at the door of the building, I hesitated. What if the car was outside? I looked out the side window. The street seemed deserted, but the air carried an almost palpable tension, like a rubber band stretched to its maximum. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and ran to the bike. I turned the key, but the engine didn't respond. I tried again. Nothing. The panel was dead, as if the battery had been ripped out. It was at that moment that I smelled it. There was a faint smell of gasoline in the air, and then I saw it. A thin line of fuel ran from the underside of the bike into the gutter. I was screwed. I turned around, trying to decide what to do. And that's when I heard the sound. Slow, shuffling steps, echoing along the sidewalk. I didn't need to look to know it was him. The sound was coming from the exact direction where the black car used to be. His heart almost exploded in his chest. I looked around for an exit and ran towards the alley next to the building. The footsteps quickened behind me. I turned the corner and threw myself behind a metal trash can, holding my breath. The sound of footsteps grew closer, slower. Through the gap between the dumpster and the wall, I saw the person's legs passing by. Black boots, dirty with dried mud. The smell of gasoline seemed to be coming from him. The man stopped right next to me. I could hear his heavy, ragged breathing, as if he was savoring the moment. I remained motionless, barely breathing. Time seemed to distort. I heard the muffled sound of my heartbeat in my ear, while that man, or whatever it was, remained standing inches away from me. Then suddenly, he spoke. The voice was low, hoarse, almost a whisper. "I warned you. You shouldn't have called the police." The sound chilled me to the core. I reflexively closed my eyes, as if that would make me invisible. I heard the steps resume, slowly, moving away down the alley. I waited until I heard nothing else, and then I got up on wobbly legs and ran back to the building. I locked the door and went straight to the apartment. As soon as I entered, I looked out the window. The black car was there again, but this time with its headlights on and the engine off. I spent the night leaning against the wall, keeping an eye on the door. I didn't sleep for a second. As soon as the sun began to rise, the car disappeared. I grabbed my things and went straight to my parents' house in a neighboring city. I spent a week there, but I couldn't relax, so I decided to go back to the apartment during the day to get the rest of my things. When I got there, everything seemed normal, except for one thing. My cell phone, which I had left on the bed, was on the floor, screen facing down. I turned the device over and saw that there was a single photo in the gallery, taken during the night. It was an image of myself, sleeping on the couch, with a message written in the reflection of the window behind me. "See you soon." I don't remember exactly what I felt at that moment, It was a mixture of dread, disbelief, and an overwhelming feeling of helplessness. I grabbed my cell phone and ran out of the apartment. I never went back there. I went straight to the police station and showed the photo to the investigator. He looked, frowned, and asked, "Are you sure you don't recognize the reflection?" I was confused. "What reflection?" I asked. He zoomed in on the window, right next to the message. And that's when I saw it. Behind me, in the photo, I could clearly see the reflection of a man's face. But it wasn't the guy in the cap. It was me. But there was something wrong. The reflected face looked older, tired, and had a deep cut on its forehead. The investigator just shook his head and said, That doesn't make sense." Since that day, I have never seen the black car again. But some things have changed. Sometimes when I look in the mirror, I see the same cut on my forehead that appeared in the reflection in that photo. Even though, when I touch it, the skin is smooth. And every now and then, my cell phone vibrates in the middle of the night. Always the same message. Always from the deactivated number. "It's not over yet." I don't know who was in that car or what really happened, but I know one thing. Whoever was following me knew exactly who I was. Or maybe he knew what I would become. This happened in the second semester of college, when I was 20 years old and doing an internship at an accounting firm in the city center. My routine was busy. I left class in the morning, worked until 6 p.m., and sometimes I needed to stay late to help finish reports. On one of those nights, I left around 9 p.m. and went straight to the bus stop. The street was almost deserted, with that uncomfortable silence that only exists in the city center after a certain hour. The spot was under a streetlight that blinked every now and then, casting weird shadows on the ground. When I got there, I saw that there was another person waiting. A hooded man, standing with his back turned, with his hands in the pockets of a black hoodie. At first, I didn't pay much attention. It was just someone else waiting for the bus, right? But as time passed, I began to feel strangely uncomfortable. The guy didn't move. Nothing. He didn't even move his feet, look at his cell phone, or change his position. And look, 4 different buses passed by while I was there. He simply stood there, motionless, as if he were a wax figure. The only thing you could see were his fingertips sticking out of his pocket. Long, dirty fingernails, as if he had recently dug dirt. I tried to convince myself that it was just a homeless person or someone weird, but my heart didn't seem to believe it. I was already starting to get restless, looking at the clock every 30 seconds. My bus was supposed to arrive at 9:40 p.m., but that night it seemed late. The silence around was suffocating. The only thing I could hear was the intermittent click of the streetlight flashing. Suddenly, the man tilted his head slightly to the side, as if he had heard my thoughts. I couldn't see his face, but the gesture was so subtle and, at the same time, so calculated that it made me shiver from head to toe. I tried to hide it, looked at my cell phone, and sent a message to my brother, letting him know that I was at work and that there was a strange guy near me. He only responded with, "Be smart and let me know when you get on the bus." The minutes dragged by. When I finally saw the headlights of my bus coming around the corner, I felt instant relief. The vehicle stopped with a creak, and I almost ran up, sitting in the window on the opposite side of the stop. I wanted to see the man from afar, just to be safe. The bus started to move, and I looked out the window. The spot was empty. There wasn't time for him to leave. I had looked at the exact moment the bus pulled away. The man simply wasn't there anymore. The chills came back with a vengeance, and the worst part, The streetlight was still flickering, casting a motionless shadow on the ground, as if someone was still standing there. I arrived home with sweaty hands. As soon as I got off the bus, I looked around 10 times before crossing the street. I almost ran into the building, locking the door behind me and checking the electronic gate twice. I went up to my apartment on the 2nd floor, trying to convince myself that I was exaggerating. But that note, that presence at the bus stop, and that figure on the corner, none of this seemed like it was in my head. I locked the apartment door, threw my bag on the sofa, and called my brother. I asked him to come sleep there that night. He laughed at first, thinking I was being dramatic, but changed his tone when he heard about the note. "I'm going now," he said. While I waited, I went to the kitchen to drink water and tried to calm down. The room was silent, except for the faint noise of the refrigerator. I looked at the clock, 11:10 p.m. My brother shouldn't be long. I decided to take a look out the window, and it was there that the terror hit me in full. On the other side of the street, under the yellow light of a streetlight, there was a man in a black hooded sweatshirt standing directly in front of my building. Even from a distance, you could see that he wasn't looking at the wrong window. He looked at me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I picked up my cell phone and dialed my brother, almost dropping the device. He answered on the 2nd ring. "I'm coming. I'm on the corner." As soon as my brother said he was arriving, I felt a tinge of relief. I continued looking out the window, without blinking. But the man below didn't move. The hood covered most of his face, but what little skin he could see looked strange, too pale. Suddenly, the cell phone vibrated in my hand, with a message notification. I looked at the screen and felt my heart stop for a second. It was a message with no identified number, just one sentence. "He can't protect you." I dropped my cell phone on the floor and ran to the door, unlocked the chain and waited for my brother. Minutes later, I heard the sound of his motorcycle engine. I opened the door and he ran up the stairs. When he entered the apartment, I ran to hug him and told him everything. He went straight to the window. The man was no longer there. My brother got angry and said that if this guy showed up again, just call, and he would resolve the situation. That night, we slept with the couch against the door and a knife on the coffee table. The next morning, my brother went with me to the police station. We showed the note and described the hooded man. The police officer who attended to us looked at the paper with a strange expression. I asked if he had ever seen anything similar. He sighed, opened a drawer, and took out a plastic note with another note, almost identical to mine, with the same irregular handwriting. The only difference was the message. "I told you not to take the bus." The police officer explained that, months earlier, a young woman had filed a similar report. She was also followed by a hooded man after leaving work at night. I asked what happened to her. The officer hesitated and said, "She disappeared 2 weeks later. They never found the guy." I returned home terrified and decided not to go to the internship at night anymore. For weeks, no sign of the man. I thought the nightmare was over. But a few days ago, I went to get my coat from the closet and found another note in my pocket. This time, the paper was crumpled and dirty, with that unmistakable handwriting. "We still have a bus to catch." I've never been one to scare easily. I always thought these reports of strange connections and invisible presences were pure imagination. But a few months ago, I started receiving calls from an unknown number, always between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. I answered, said, "Hello," but no one responded. just slow, rhythmic breathing, as if someone was leaning on the phone, listening to every sound I made. At first, I thought it was a prank, but the pattern was always the same, every night, at the same time. I blocked the number, but the calls continued, always with the identifier appearing as unknown. On the fourth night in a row, I lost my patience. When I answered, instead of hanging up, I remained silent too, trying to hear beyond that breathing. Suddenly, I decided to ask, "Who are you? What do you want?" The silence on the other side lasted a few seconds until breathing became faster, almost anxious. And then I heard. The voice was a child's, low and clear. "You moved away, but I'm still in. Your old room." My heart stopped. I couldn't say anything. I just hung up the phone. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. I tried to convince myself that this was some bad joke. Maybe a mistake, someone calling the wrong number. But that phrase kept ringing in my head. Your old room. How would anyone know this? I moved out of that apartment almost a year ago, and no one other than close friends knew about it. In the following days, the calls continued. Always the same pattern. Breathing, silence, and then that childish voice repeating, "I'm still here. In your room?" I decided to ignore it. I picked up the phone, but the sound on the line became strangely distorted, as if someone was breathing on the other end even though there was no connection. Last week, I went to the old building, driven by curiosity, and that feeling that something didn't make sense. The new resident, a man named Andre, answered me with a confused look when I asked about strange calls. No calls, but... He hesitated. "The intercom rings every night, always at the same time. When I answer, I only hear breathing. And the other day, I heard a child's voice saying, 'He's going to come back.' A shiver ran up my spine. I didn't tell Andre anything. I just thanked him and left, trying to ignore the fact that night, the phone rang again, even though I had unplugged it. That night, when the phone rang again, I didn't know what to think anymore. The device was unplugged, but the insistent sound echoed throughout the apartment. I answered, my hand shaking. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. On the other side, breathing became slower, as if the person was savoring the moment. "You came back. I knew you would." The tone of the voice was still childish, but now it had something strange, a kind of distorted satisfaction. "I didn't come back," I replied. "You are mistaken." Silence came next, long, suffocating. Then the child said, almost in a whisper, "You don't need to go back. I'll find you." I threw the phone on the floor and stayed up the rest of the night. When the sun came up, I went through my toolbox and installed an extra lock on the door. The next day, I changed the entire lock, but the next morning, the phone rang again. I let it play until it stopped. When I went to check the device, a voice message had been recorded. I pressed play and heard, first the familiar breathing, then the voice. "It's locked, but it's not closed. Not for me." I ran to the door and tested the lock. It was intact. But on the floor was a small, damp footprint, pointing in the direction of my room. My mind panicked. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and went to the bedroom. The door was ajar, which was strange because I remember closing it before going to sleep. I pushed slowly with my fingertips. The window was open, the curtain flapping in the cold, early morning breeze. On the floor, more small, damp footprints, going from the center of the room to the darkest corner next to the wardrobe. I pointed my cell phone's flashlight there. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. "I know you're here," I said, my voice breaking. The silence was interrupted by a low, childish laugh coming directly from the top of the wardrobe. I lifted the phone and the light revealed something that made me instinctively step back. On top of the furniture, there was a child squatting with pale skin and completely black eyes, looking at me with a crooked smile. Her face looked wrong, like it had been molded with hot wax and then deformed. "I found you," whispered the voice, perfectly identical to the one I heard on the phone calls. On impulse, I ran out of the room and locked the door from the outside. I held onto the doorknob with all my might as the child, or whatever it was, began to knock on the other side, rhythmically. 3 beats, pause. 3 beats, pause. Then the voice, muffled. "You shouldn't have left me there, alone." I held the handle until my fingers hurt. The knocking continued for a while, always in the same pattern. 3 beats, pause. 3 beats, pause. And with each sequence, the voice repeated almost like a song. "You shouldn't have left me. You shouldn't have left me." The air in the corridor became cold, and the doorknob began to turn on its own, with a force that seemed impossible for something so small. When I felt like I couldn't hold it any longer, the pounding stopped. The silence that came after was even worse. I waited for endless minutes, without moving, until I heard the sound of soft footsteps moving away. When I found the courage to look under the door, I saw a wet trail heading towards the living room. I ran to the exit, unlocked the main door, and left barefoot down the building stairs. I didn't look back. I spent the night in the car, parked a few blocks away. When the day dawned, I went back with a friend to get my things. The apartment was ransacked, the telephone was ripped from the wall, and footprints were scattered everywhere, always ending up in front of the closet. We called the police, who found no signs of forced entry. As we left, I took one last look at the room. On the wardrobe mirror, someone wrote with their finger on the tarnished surface, "You should never have left that room." After that day, I moved to another city and changed my number. I spent weeks staring at the phone, afraid it would ring. But the call stopped. For a while, I thought it was over. Until yesterday. It was early morning and the phone rang. The number appeared as unknown. I answered without saying anything. The breath came, slow and familiar. My stomach turned. After a few seconds, the childish voice spoke softly. "Do you like the new room?" I immediately looked at my bedroom door. It was open, although I remembered closing it before going to sleep. The cold in the hallway was the same as I felt that night in the old apartment. I didn't sleep anymore. I sat on the couch with the knife in my hand, waiting for the sun to rise. When morning came, I went to the room. I found nothing except a single handprint on the wardrobe mirror, small and damp. I've thought about leaving here too, but I know it's no use. It's not the apartment. It's not the number. Whatever you are, you came with me. And deep down, I think it was always there. I was just waiting for me to get back to our room. I was 8 years old when my younger brother, Davy, disappeared. He was 5 years old at the time, a curious and energetic boy who loved hiding in the most unlikely places. The day he disappeared, we were playing in the backyard, as always. I clearly remember the last thing he said to me. "I'm going to hide in a place you'll never find me." I laughed, closed my eyes, and started counting. When I finished and looked around, he was no longer there. We searched everywhere. My parents called the police, neighbors helped, but no one ever found him. It was as if David had evaporated. For years I had nightmares about that phrase. I never met him. Until now. This happened a few weeks ago, when I moved into a small apartment in the city center. It was an old building, the kind with wooden floors that creaked underfoot. I chose the place because I needed something simple, functional. Everything went normally until one night, while I was washing the dishes and looked out the kitchen window. From the neighboring building, in the apartment directly opposite mine, there was a figure standing behind the curtain. A boy, thin, with brown hair, and his face somewhat blurred by the distance. But that wasn't what stopped me. The boy was wearing a faded red t-shirt, identical to the one Davy was wearing the day he disappeared. My heart almost stopped. I dropped the plate in the sink, which shattered on the floor, and I stood there, paralyzed. The boy was still there, motionless, with his face partially hidden by the curtain. I knew it was impossible, but that silhouette, that hair, was Davy. I stared for a few seconds, waiting for him to move, for him to do something. But no, he just stood there, watching me. I took out my cell phone and took a photo. When I looked at the image on the screen, I felt a shiver run up my spine. The window of the other building was completely empty. There was no one there. I thought I had imagined everything. Maybe tiredness, or missing my brother, messing with me. But that night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard a noise coming from the kitchen, a faint crack, then another. I got up, turned on the light, and went there. The noise was coming from the window. As I approached, I felt the cold ground beneath my bare feet, and looked outside. The boy was there again, now clearly visible, with his pale face pressed against the glass of the neighboring apartment. But this time, he smiled, and he moved his lips slowly, as if saying something. Couldn't understand it, but I recognized the expression. It was the same thing David did when he was playing hide and seek. I couldn't sleep after that. I sat on the bed, staring at the window, waiting for the boy to reappear. But the night passed in silence. In the morning, I decided to do something. I took the photo I had taken and went to the doorman of the neighboring building. I showed it to him and asked who lived in the apartment opposite mine. The man frowned, looked at the photo, and then at me. This apartment has been empty for years, sir. The last tenant died almost a decade ago. No one has rented it since. I insisted. I told him what I had seen. The doorman turned a little pale and looked away. Look, you weren't the first to talk about this boy. Other residents have said they saw a child there, but it always disappears when they look closely. I returned home with my head spinning. How was it possible? And why did that boy look so much like Davy? That night, I decided to stay awake again. At 2:43 a.m., I felt a sudden chill and went to the kitchen. I looked out the window and there he was, the boy in the red t-shirt, standing on the other side. This time, the curtain did not cover his face. It was David. I was sure. The same upturned nose, the rounded chin, the messy hair. But his eyes, something about them wasn't right. They were too dark, too deep. He looked at me for a few seconds and then opened a wide, almost artificial smile. And with frightening clarity, he whispered something that I could understand this time. I found you. My knees gave way. I fell to the kitchen floor, panting, while the boy continued to stand there, watching me. His voice still echoed in my mind. I found you. It was the phrase that Davy always said when he met me during hide and seek. That didn't make sense. He disappeared more than 30 years ago. I stayed there, motionless, until I found the courage to look again. But when I looked up, the window was empty. The curtain swayed slightly, as if someone had just walked away. I closed all the windows, locked the door, and spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch with the light on. The next day, I went to the police station to try to access my brother's disappearance record. The police officer who helped me was uncomfortable with the request, but after some insistence, he brought an old folder. I leafed through the pages, reviewing photos and statements from the time, until a detail caught my eye. The report said that in the last search done in the backyard of our old house, the sniffer dogs had identified a strong smell of disturbed earth near the base of a tree. But the investigation was shelved due to lack of evidence. That tree was exactly where David said he would hide that afternoon. I left the police station with my mind racing. I went straight back to the apartment and went to the kitchen window. The neighboring building was silent, with the curtain to the empty apartment slightly open. I stood there staring at that window as if it could give me answers. Then I felt the air change. The environment became colder, more charged, and the boy appeared again. Now he was closer to the glass, with his hands flat on the surface. His expression was no longer playful. He looked sad. He moved his lips slowly, and this time I could understand perfectly what he was saying. "Help me out." My instinct was to back away, but something about those words grabbed me. I took out my cell, phone, and recorded a video of that window. As soon as I stopped recording, I looked at the building again. The boy was gone. I rewatched the video, and for a moment I thought I hadn't captured anything. But in the last second of the recording, a low, distorted voice whispered something. "The tree, the tree, the tree." My entire body shivered. I called my father, who still lived in the same house, and asked if the tree was still there. He said yes. I didn't think twice. I took the car keys and went straight there. I arrived at my parents' house with my heart racing. My father, surprised by my sudden visit, met me at the gate. I didn't want to explain much. I just asked for a shovel and went straight to the yard. The old tree with the gnarled trunk was still there, in the same place. The ground around them seemed untouched, but the air was heavy, thick, almost suffocating. I started digging, feeling sweat running down my forehead, despite the cold of the night. Each strike of the shovel on the ground was accompanied by an oppressive silence. I dug for minutes that felt like hours until the blade hit something hard. I knelt down and began to remove the dirt with shaking hands. First, a piece of red fabric, faded by time, appeared. I continued digging, and just below, small, fragile bones emerged. It was a child's body. David's body. I let out a sob and fell back, feeling a wave of emotions that mixed relief and horror. My father called the police, and forensics confirmed that the remains were indeed my brother's. The report showed fracture marks on his skull, indicating that he was hit by something heavy. The investigation was reopened, but they never found out who did it. The night after the funeral, I went back to the apartment and threw myself on the couch, exhausted. I went to the kitchen, instinctively looked at the window. The apartment next door was empty, the curtain closed. I sighed, ready to walk away. But then I saw something in the reflection of the glass. Behind me in the hallway was Davy. Not as a macabre haunting, but as my younger brother, with a serene face and a slight smile. He looked at me and said, in a clear, soft voice that I hadn't heard in decades, "Thanks for finding me." I blinked, and he wasn't there anymore. Since then, the window of the neighboring building has remained empty. But sometimes, in the silence of the night, I still hear the distant echo of a child's giggle. So, what do you think happened in this story? Have you ever experienced something similar or know someone who has had an experience like this? Tell us here in the comments. I really want to know your opinion. And don't forget, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any of the next videos with scary stories and stories that defy logic. Your interaction is essential for us to continue bringing content like this. Now, if you want to dive even deeper into this world of mysteries and inexplicable events, click on the next video that will appear on the screen. I'm sure you won't regret it. See you there. Until later.